Finally, we have it. After 5 days of intense fighting, Thailand and Cambodia have agreed to an unconditional ceasefire. Malaysia hosted the talks in Putrajaya. But if we were to think that the conflict is finally over, I'm afraid I don't think that's correct. I don't want to sound alarmist, but what we have seen is not just an ordinary border skirmish. I think it is a warning of a new kind of threat, a threat that we are not yet ready to face. In this video, let me break down what I mean. If we have not met, my name is Dr. Ilembo Karupanan, former Malaysian ambassador, well over 30 years of experience in the Malaysian Foreign Service. And guess what? This is my name tag, which I discovered recently in one of those boxes. In my career, I've sat in ASEAN summits, high-level meetings. I have written extensively about ASEAN. I've given talks about this organization. In order to understand the future, I think we must revisit the past. ASEAN wasn't born out of trade necessity. It was actually born out of fear. Before 1967, there was confrontation between Malaysia and Indonesia. Confrontation, for those who do not know, was a conflict between the two countries, resulting out of Malaysia's decision to expand, to form a federation, including the states of Sabah and Sarawak. Brunei and Singapore were also supposed to join. What happened was a series of crises were triggered. Indonesia launched military aggression and diplomatic campaign against Malaysia. Both Philippines and Indonesia broke out diplomatic relations. A rebellion broke out in Brunei. Racial crisis in Singapore. It was chaotic. Many different types of crises. But emerging leaders such as Tun Abdul Razak, Suharto and others, they realized that there was a common thread that was linking all these crises. The threat was the threat of communism, the ideological divide between the West and the East, the Cold War divide. And that clarity of thought was vital. When they created ASEAN, it served as a perfect vehicle for them to collaborate, cooperate, while at the same time keeping that threat at bay. It is no surprise that in the Cambodian invasion of Vietnam, for example, ASEAN was able to put forward a strong, unified stance in dealing with the problem. Fast forward a generation later, ASEAN faced a second existential threat, and that threat ironically came with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Well, when the Berlin Wall fell, the Cold War disappeared, the old ideological divide that was the source of threat for ASEAN also disappeared. But guess what? A new one took its place, and that threat was now the threat of economic protectionism, mainly from the countries that were developed. You had the troubles in the Uruguay round of the general agreements of trade and tariffs. They were stalled. The developed countries were beginning to remove the so-called general system of preferences which they had accorded to less developed countries to catch up. North America, there was this NAFTA. Europe seemed to be forming a fortress with the Maastricht Treaty, a common economic bloc. We had the Plaza Accord, which decimated the currencies of Asia. In short, the developed world looked like they were forming clubs, and ASEAN wasn't on the guest list. What ASEAN did was to take matters in their own hands and decided that economic integration among themselves would be the best way to deal with this problem. So we had the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, and many other free trade agreements followed from that point onwards. And ASEAN also expanded its dialogue partnership so that ASEAN could become a much more unified economic production base and consumption base as well. So that allowed ASEAN to somewhat mitigate the effects of the protectionist measures taken by the West and grow into what it finally became today, an economic powerhouse, something like the fourth biggest or fifth biggest economic entity globally speaking. Fast forward one more generation, ASEAN is now facing yet another existential threat. It's third. This time, The threat is not coming from the outside. It is a threat that is emerging from within. And this kind of threat is something that ASEAN is not used to dealing with. Its forte has been to deal with external threats, but for the first time, it's facing a new kind of existential threat, a threat that is coming from the inside. And this, I think, is what we are seeing with these conflicts that we have seen, the latest being the Thailand-Cambodia border wars. And this threat is a threat of nationalism. No, it's not the nationalism of the liberation from colonial power or oppression. It is a nationalism as a political strategy. Unlike communism, which emerged from the ideological margins, this threat of nationalism is state-sponsored. It comes from the state itself, political parties, elites, members of the government. And this nationalism doesn't stop at national borders. Often it spills across borders into neighboring countries, bringing along with it issues such as territories, borders, rivers, temples, history, minorities, illegal migrants, economic opportunities lost, transnational crimes, scams, and so on and so forth. What we are seeing is nationalism sans frontières. And examples, well, besides the Thai-Cambodia conflict that we have seen now, we have seen many others. Maybe we have not recognized them for what it is. We have, for example, the long-standing problem between Malaysia and Indonesia over trivial issues such as language, songs, delicacies. And when nationalism is not controlled, spills out into the across the borders, then we have issues. But this nationalism is driven by domestic fragility. Weak coalition governments seeking to spread nationalistic fervor to distract attention from themselves, trying to look for economic scapegoats for failed economic policies. ASEAN has no mechanism to deal with this kind of threats. Nationalism is considered to be a domestic concern. ASEAN's norm of non-interference in the internal affairs of other states prevent it from speaking out on these kind of problems because they are supposed to be regulated by the states themselves. Plus, ASEAN naturally has always found it easier to point fingers at the outside world for its troubles rather than to point inwards to its own problems. Back to this Thailand-Cambodia conflict. While the ceasefire may hold, it depends on the follow-up actions that are going to be taken by both governments and Malaysia as the chair of ASEAN. But what it revealed is something very disturbing. When ASEAN members resort to using force against each other, despite the fact that it has signed what is known as the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, and we have the zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality, it is very troubling indeed. It shows that these norms, which I thought had become internalized deeply within ASEAN, simply remains at a surface level. It is still superficial. Nationalism is a real threat because this threat is one that wears the national flag. Sometimes it wears a uniform, it speaks the local language, and even sits in ASEAN meetings. So history shows that ASEAN faces an existential threat once every generation. In the 1960s, it was the threat of communism as an ideology. In the 1990s, it was economic protectionism. And today, it is unbridled nationalism. The question is whether ASEAN will name it and act on it. Because so long as it doesn't clearly identify the problem, it cannot find a solution to it. ASEAN needs to think carefully and very deeply about this new existential threat that is emerging from inside. I think it is something that deserves a special summit something that is not hidden in volumes and volumes of communiques, but a frank discussion among leaders on how to deal with it, how to curb it, and perhaps even develop instruments and norms. I think it is crucial because this is a kind of existential threat that ASEAN has not faced before. As I have said, it is somewhat of an expert when it comes to dealing with the external threat, but something that is emerging from inside is something new. And it could be something that, if it's not taken care of quickly, it could slowly but surely erode ASEAN from inside. If you thought this analysis is interesting, I would like you to watch another video that I just did a few days ago about the Cambodia-Thailand talks and whether Malaysia would be able to resolve this issue. The link is somewhere down there. And as usual, I would love to hear your comments. Please hit the like and share this video widely.